I remember the night Prince Chuma took my brother like it was yesterday. The air was thick with fear, and the moon hid behind the clouds, as if afraid to watch what was about to happen. Prince Chuma wasn't always like this. Growing up, people talked about him as the future king who would bring peace and prosperity. But something changed when he got older. He became different. The kindness in his eyes vanished, replaced by something darker, colder. People whispered that he had made a pact with spirits from the forest, that he had started practicing forbidden things, but no one dared confront him. After all, he was the prince. It started small. At first, it was just animals disappearing. Then it was children. My brother Chuma was the first to go missing from our village. He was only 12 years old. That night we had all been asleep. It was quiet, too quiet. I remember waking up to a strange sound outside, like footsteps, but not quite. They were soft, almost like someone was gliding across the ground. I was too scared to get out of bed, but I couldn't stop listening. The footsteps stopped outside our door. Then came the voice. It was deep and unnatural. "Chuma," it whispered. "Come." I felt a chill crawl down my spine. I wanted to scream, to wake up my parents, but I couldn't move. My body felt frozen. I heard the door creak open, slow and careful. And then, just like that, the footsteps started again, moving away from the house. When I finally got the courage to look, my brother's bed was empty. We searched for him everywhere the next day. My father and the other men from the village went into the forest, calling his name, but there was no trace of him. The elders said it was the spirits that took him, but I knew better. It wasn't spirits, it was the prince. A week later, another child went missing, and then another. Each time, the same strange footsteps, the same whispering voice. By now, everyone was too scared to leave their homes at night. But we all knew where the children were going, even if no one said it out loud. One evening, I overheard my father talking to the other men in the village. "We have to stop him," one of them said. "He's using the children for something. We can't let this continue." My father agreed. They planned to confront Prince Chuma. I wanted to go with them, but my father forbade it. "Stay here," he said. "It's too dangerous." But I couldn't just sit back and do nothing. Chuma was still out there somewhere, so that night I followed them, staying far enough behind so they wouldn't see me. I was scared, but I had to know what was really happening. They reached the prince's palace just as the sun began to set. The gates were open, as if he was expecting them. Inside, the air was colder than it should have been, like the warmth of the earth had been drained from the ground. Shadows seemed to move on their own, shifting in strange ways. In the middle of the courtyard stood Prince Chuma. He smiled when he saw my father and the others approach, but it wasn't the kind of smile that reached his eyes. His face looked wrong. His skin was pale, and his eyes were so dark that it felt like they were sucking in the light around him. "You've come to accuse me, haven't you?" he said, his voice soft but full of menace. "You think I've taken your children?" No one answered. My father stepped forward, his face stern. "Where is my son, Chuma?" The prince laughed, a cold, cruel sound that made my stomach twist. "Your son is where he needs to be," he said. "All the children are. They belong to me now." Before my father could react, something moved in the shadows. At first I thought it was just a trick of the light, but then I saw them. Figures, small and thin, stepping out from the darkness. It was the children. Their faces were blank, their eyes empty. But they were different now. Their skin was grey and their movements were unnatural, jerky, like they weren't fully alive. I gasped, unable to hold it in. The children looked like they were under some kind of spell. But it wasn't just a spell. It was like they were trapped, not fully themselves anymore. My father turned to look at the children, his face filled with horror. "Chuma!" he called, his voice trembling. My brother stepped forward. He didn't speak, didn't blink. It was as if he couldn't hear us at all. The other men started shouting, calling for their children, but none of them responded. Prince Chuma's smile grew wider. "They belong to me now," he repeated. "You can't take them back." The men rushed forward, but before they could reach the children, the ground beneath us began to tremble. The air filled with a strange buzzing sound, and a thick mist rose up from the ground, swirling around the prince. I watched in terror as the mist wrapped around the children, pulling them back into the shadows. "You should never have come here," Chuma said, his voice now echoing, as if coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. The mist grew thicker, and soon I couldn't see anything. I heard my father shouting, the other men calling out in fear, but I couldn't move. The air felt heavy, like it was pressing down on me. And then, just as suddenly as it started, the mist vanished. The children were gone. My father and the others were left standing in the courtyard, their faces pale with shock. Prince Chuma was nowhere to be seen. It was as if he had disappeared along with the children. That was the last time anyone saw the prince. He never returned to the palace, and the children were never found. Some say he still roams the forest at night, searching for more souls to take. Others say he vanished into the spirit world, where he made his pact. But I know the truth. Prince Chuma didn't vanish. He's still out there, watching, waiting. And every now and then, when the moon hides behind the clouds and the air grows too still, I hear those strange footsteps again outside my door. After that night, everything in the village changed. People stopped talking about the missing children and the prince. They acted like it never happened, like the fear had sunk too deep into their bones to even mention his name. But I couldn't forget. I couldn't pretend. I wasn't the only one who noticed the silence. The elders seemed nervous too. They held more meetings, speaking in hushed voices, their eyes darting toward the forest every time the wind blew from that direction. They were scared, but they didn't know what to do. No one knew how to fight a prince with dark powers. For weeks, I stayed awake every night, listening for those footsteps, expecting to hear the whispering voice again, but it didn't come. The village was quiet, too quiet. It felt wrong. Then one evening, my father called me outside. His face was tired, more worn than I'd ever seen it. The lines around his eyes seemed deeper, his shoulders heavier, as if carrying the weight of what had happened to my brother was breaking him from the inside. "We can't just wait for him to come again," he said quietly. "We need to do something." "What can we do?" I asked, my voice shaky. "He's not human anymore." My father didn't answer for a moment. He just stared at the horizon, where the sun was setting behind the trees. The sky was red, like blood, and I shivered. Finally, he said, "There's someone. In the hills. A healer. They say she knows things about the spirits, things no one else dares speak of. I had heard of the old woman who lived in the hills. People called her a witch, said she was dangerous, but others whispered that she had knowledge of the ancient ways to protect people from dark magic." The next day, my father and I set out to find her. The path to the hills was long, and the further we went, the darker the forest became. Even though it was daytime, the trees blocked out most of the sunlight, casting strange shadows on the ground. Every sound made my heart race. A rustling in the bushes, a crack of a branch behind us. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching. After hours of walking, we reached a small clearing. In the middle of it stood a simple hut, smoke rising from the roof. My father knocked on the door, and for a moment there was no response. Then the door creaked open, and a woman appeared. She was older than I expected, her skin wrinkled like dried leaves, her eyes sharp and piercing. "You've come because of the prince," she said, her voice raspy but certain. My father nodded. "He's taken our children, my son. We need to stop him." The woman stepped aside, motioning for us to enter. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of herbs and smoke. Dried plants hung from the ceiling, and strange symbols were carved into the walls. It felt like another world, far from our village, far from the danger we had come to escape. The healer sat down by a small fire, gesturing for us to sit as well. "Prince Chuma is no longer a man," she said. "He has given himself to the spirits of the forest. He's bound to them now, and they to him." "What does that mean?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "It means he cannot be defeated by ordinary means. He has become something different. The children he takes are part of the pact. Their souls feed his power." My heart sank. Was my brother really gone? His soul trapped with the prince forever? But, she continued, her eyes narrowing, there is a way to stop him. We leaned in, desperate for hope. The spirits he serves are bound to the earth, to the forest, she explained. If you can break that connection, sever the bond between him and the spirits, he will lose his power. But it's dangerous. The spirits will fight back. How do we do it? My father asked, his voice steady but full of fear. You must go to the heart of the forest where the pact was made. There you will find the source of his power, a tree marked with the symbols of the old magic. Burn it, destroy it, but be warned, the spirits will try to stop you, and the prince will know. We left the hut with heavy hearts, knowing what lay ahead. That night we prepared. My father gathered firewood and oil, while I sharpened a knife, though I didn't know if it would be of any use. The healer had given us a charm for protection, an amulet made of twisted roots and stones. She said it would help, but I still felt the weight of fear pressing down on me. At dawn, we set out for the heart of the forest. The trees grew thicker as we went deeper, their branches twisting like fingers reaching for us. The further we went, the colder the air became, until it felt like winter had settled into our bones. I kept my hand on the amulet, whispering prayers under my breath. After what felt like hours, we reached a clearing. In the center stood a massive tree, its bark covered in strange, dark symbols. It was the same tree I had seen in my dreams, the one that haunted my nights ever since Chuma disappeared. My father handed me the oil, and I poured it around the base of the tree. My hands shook, but I forced myself to keep going. This was our only chance. Just as we were about to light the fire, the wind picked up. The trees around us began to creak, their branches swaying violently. Shadows moved between the trees, figures, dark and fast. The spirits. And then from the darkness, I heard it, the same voice that had taken my brother. Stop! It whispered, low and menacing. You cannot break the pact. Prince Chuma stepped out from the shadows, his face twisted into something almost unrecognizable. His eyes glowed with a strange, unnatural light, and his skin seemed to shimmer with the energy of the spirits. You think you can stop me? He sneered. You are nothing. But my father didn't hesitate. He struck a match and dropped it onto the oil-soaked wood. Flames erupted, climbing the tree in an instant. The prince screamed, a horrible, inhuman sound, as the fire spread. The ground beneath us shook, and the spirits wailed, their forms flickering like smoke in the wind. Prince Chuma lunged at us, but as the flames consumed the tree, his movement slowed. His body began to wither, his skin cracking like dry earth. He reached for me, but his hand crumbled to ash before it could touch me. And then, just like that, it was over. The tree burned to the ground, leaving nothing but smouldering embers. The spirits were gone, and so was Prince Chuma. We stood there in silence, the weight of what had happened sinking in. My brother was gone, and so were the other children, but we had stopped the prince. The curse was broken. That night, as we returned to the village, I felt a strange sense of peace. The wind was gentle, and the sky was clear. The forest was quiet. For the first time in a long time, it felt like we were free. The days that followed were strange. The village, once haunted by fear, began to feel alive again. People started leaving their homes at night, no longer afraid of the strange footsteps or the whispering voice. The children played in the streets, and for the first time in weeks, there was laughter in the air. It felt like a new beginning. But the cost of that freedom was heavy. My father and I knew that, even though we had broken the curse, the children, including my brother Chuma, were never coming back. The elders told us to be grateful that we had saved the village from an unspeakable evil. They told stories of how the prince's power had grown over time, how it could have destroyed us all if we hadn't acted. But that didn't make it easier. I couldn't shake the memories of that night, the way Chuma had looked, his eyes empty, his body no longer his own. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw him, standing there in the shadows, lost to something I couldn't understand. And even though the prince was gone, the guilt stayed with me. Maybe if I had been braver that night when I first heard those footsteps, I could have saved him. maybe things would have been different. My father, too, changed after what happened. He became quieter, his laughter less frequent. Sometimes, I would catch him staring at the place where Chuma used to sit, his face hard, his hands clenched. He didn't speak of the prince or the spirits again, but I knew it weighed on him as much as it did on me. Weeks turned into months, and the village moved on. But I didn't. I would often walk to the edge of the forest, staring into the trees, waiting for something, anything. A sign that Chuma was still out there, that maybe, somehow, I could bring him back. But the forest was silent now. The spirits had retreated, and the tree we had burned was nothing but ash. Then, one night as I lay in bed, something strange happened. I heard it, a faint, almost imperceptible sound, like footsteps outside my window. My heart raced, memories of that terrible night rushing back to me. I held my breath listening. It was soft, but unmistakable. The same sound that had haunted me all those months ago. I got out of bed slowly, careful not to wake my father. My hands shook as I approached the door, every step heavier than the last. Part of me wanted to run, to hide under the covers and pretend I hadn't heard anything, but I had to know, I had to be sure. When I opened the door, the air outside was still. The night was clear, the moon high in the sky, casting long shadows across the ground, but there was no one there, no strange figure, no whispering voice. I sighed, relief and fear mixing inside me. Maybe it was just my imagination, a trick of the mind from all those nights spent worrying. But then, just as I turned to go back inside, I heard it. A voice. Faint, distant, but clear enough to send a chill down my spine. Come. I froze. The word echoed in my ears, low and familiar, like it had all those months ago. But this time it wasn't the prince's voice, it was softer, younger. It was Chuma's voice. My breath caught in my throat. I looked around, my eyes scanning the darkness, searching for any sign of him. Chuma, I whispered, my voice trembling. Is that you? There was no answer. Just the wind rustling through the trees and the quiet of the night. But I knew what I had heard. For the first time since that night, hope flickered inside me. Maybe he wasn't lost. Maybe the spirits hadn't taken him completely. Maybe there was a way to bring him back after all. I spent the next few days trying to convince myself that I had imagined it, that the voice was just a dream. But deep down, I knew. Chuma was still out there, somewhere between the world of the living and the dead, and I couldn't let him stay there. I went back to the old woman in the hills, desperate for answers. She listened to me quietly, her wrinkled face expressionless. When I told her about the voice, her eyes darkened. The prince is gone, she said slowly, but the bond with the spirits remains. Your brother's soul is caught between worlds, held by the magic of that pact. Can I save him? I asked, my voice barely a whisper. The healer stared at me for a long time before answering. There is a way, she said finally, but it will not be easy, and it will not be without cost. I didn't care. Whatever the cost, I would pay it. I couldn't leave Chuma out there, lost and alone, not after everything. She told me what I needed to do. I would have to go back to the forest, to the place where the tree had burned, and perform a ritual to call the spirits. I would have to offer something in return, a piece of myself, a part of my soul, to bring Chuma back from their grasp. The night of the ritual was the darkest I had ever seen. The moon hid behind thick clouds, and the air felt heavy, like the earth itself was holding its breath. My father didn't know where I had gone. I couldn't tell him. He wouldn't have understood. This was something I had to do alone. I stood in the clearing, the ashes of the burned tree still scattered on the ground. The wind whispered through the branches, carrying the faint sounds of voices, just out of reach. I knelt down, clutching the amulet the healer had given me, and began to chant the words she had taught me. At first nothing happened. The air was still, the forest silent. But then, slowly, I felt it, a shift, like the ground was pulsing beneath me. The wind picked up, swirling around me, carrying with it the same strange low whispers I had heard that night. And then, through the trees, I saw him, Chuma. He stood there, just beyond the clearing, his face pale, his eyes wide and empty. But he was there. He was real. Chuma, I whispered, my voice cracking. I'm here. I've come to bring you home. He didn't move. He just stared at me, his expression blank, like he didn't recognize me. My heart ached, but I couldn't stop now. I held out the amulet, chanting the final words of the ritual. The wind howled, the trees creaking and groaning around me. The ground trembled, and the voices grew louder, angry. And then suddenly, everything went silent. Chuma took a step forward, his eyes clearing, life returning to his face. Sister, he whispered, his voice trembling. You saved me. Tears filled my eyes as I reached out to him, pulling him close. For the first time in months I felt whole again, but as I held him I felt a strange cold sensation wash over me. My body grew heavy, my limbs numb. The price. The healer had warned me. I had given a part of myself to the spirits, and now they were taking it. But it didn't matter. Chuma was back, and that was all that mattered. As the coldness spread through me, I smiled, knowing that I had done what I set out to do. I had saved my brother, and now I would rest. As the numbness took over my body, I felt myself growing weaker, as if the life was slowly draining out of me. My limbs grew heavy, my breath shallow, but I didn't care. I looked at Chuma, alive, standing in front of me. He was back, and that was all that mattered. Sister? He whispered, his voice filled with worry as he saw me faltering. What's happening? I smiled weakly, trying to reassure him. It's okay, I whispered. You're safe now. That's all I wanted. Chuma's eyes filled with tears, his face twisted in confusion and fear. No, I can't lose you too. You can't leave me. His voice broke as he clung to my arm, trying to hold me up, but I could barely feel his touch anymore. My body was growing colder by the second, and I knew the spirits were taking their due. I had to, I managed to say, though my voice was barely audible. I had to bring you back. He shook his head, sobbing now. No, there has to be another way. We can fix this, we can... But I knew it was too late. The healer had warned me. There would be no turning back. I had made my choice, and now the spirits were claiming their price. It was the cost of breaking the bond, of freeing Chuma from their grasp. I felt my legs give way, and I collapsed to the ground, the cold earth pressing against my skin. Chuma knelt beside me, his hands trembling as he tried to pull me up, but I was too weak to move. My vision was fading, the world around me blurring into darkness, but even as the cold crept through me, I felt a strange sense of peace. I had done what I set out to do. I had saved my brother, brought him back from the darkness that had claimed him. And now I could rest, knowing that he would live, that he would be free. Don't cry, I whispered, though my voice was barely a breath. Live for me, Chuma. Be happy. That's all I ask. He sobbed harder, his grip tightening on my hand. I will, he promised, his voice shaking. I will, I swear. I smiled one last time, my heart swelling with love for him. And then, as the darkness closed in, I let go. The cold washed over me completely, and everything went still. The last thing I heard was Chuma's voice, calling my name through his tears. But I wasn't afraid anymore. I had done what I needed to do. I had saved the person I loved most in the world, and now I was at peace. Do you believe in the power of love and sacrifice? Dive deeper into this haunting tale of courage, loyalty, and the ultimate price of freedom. If this story moved you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more powerful African folktales that will leave you questioning what you're willing to sacrifice for the ones you love. Join us as we explore more stories of mystery, magic, and heart.